The next thing we want to focus on is manipulating the independent variable. So it's important to recognize that some independent variables can be manipulated while others cannot. So, like the race of a defendant in a trial, you can manipulate it so the race of that person is Latinx or Asian American, right? You can vary that based upon the manipulation. Or you can manipulate the difficulty of a task. You can make one task very easy and one task very hard, right? And similar to our kind of running example with coffee consumption, you can give people, 100 milligrams of coffee versus 200 milligrams of coffee. So you can manipulate that kind of stuff. Things that you can't manipulate are the participant's race or their gender or their year in school or their age. You can't manipulate those characteristics about a participant. But you might think that those non-manipulated independent variables could interact with manipulated independent variables to have some kind of meaningful effect. The key here for any true experiment is that you have to have at least one manipulated variable. You can have one manipulated variable and one non-manipulated variable, or two manipulated variables, but you have to have at least one variable that you are actually manipulating. If you have only non-manipulated independent variables, that would be considered a quasi-experiment because it does not involve random assignment of people to the manipulated variables. There are two types of manipulations that I want you to be aware of. The more straightforward manipulations, where you're just simply presenting uh, the stimulus to participants either verbally or in writing. So you can have people fill out a questionnaire or read about people being advantaged or disadvantaged in the legal system, and they just read it and answer some questions. In contrast, we have a stage manipulation, and this is where the researcher is trying to create a psychological state for the participant by putting them in what they believe to be a real world situation. So the best example, or one of the good examples of this is like the Milgram's obedience studies. The participants in those studies thought that they were actually shocking someone else, right? Another good example of a stage manipulation is the Ash conformity studies. In this set of studies, participants were brought in groups and they were shown a standard line. Then they were told to figure out which of these three comparison lines was the same line as the standard line. The trick here is that there was only one actual participant, right? It typically was the last participant to answer the question. The rest of the people that were there as participants were actually Confederates, right? So here we're calling them stooges, and then we have the actual participant. And what happens is that all the Confederates would give the wrong answer. So instead of saying B, which is the correct answer, they would all say A. And the question becomes, does the participant give the correct answer of B or conform to the rest of the participants and say A? What the researcher was trying to do is trying to create a context in which the participants felt as though they had to conform. So, in contrast to a more straightforward manipulation where they would read about something, they're actually now engaged in this experience to see how they would actually act. And oftentimes, when you have stage manipulations, you utilize Confederates, who are accomplices to working with the experimenter to create this real world context. So the other people who were in that study with the participant were Confederates trying to create this context in which the participant felt the need to conform and give the wrong answer. Another thing you need to think about when it comes to manipulations is the strength of that manipulation. So the strength being how different are the levels of the manipulation. So if we stick with our caffeine example, we could give some people 100 milligrams of caffeine, another group 200 milligrams of caffeine. That would be, a relatively strong manipulation. A weaker manipulation would be if you gave one group 100 milligrams and another group 105 milligrams. Because the difference between those two levels is really small, it would be considered a weak manipulation. So what you'd want to do is start out with a very strong manipulation at first when you're trying to develop and see if you have an effect. So maybe you give them something really extreme. If you want to see if caffeine leads to anxiety, maybe you give one group 100 milligrams, another group 300 milligrams. You really want to see if there's going to be a difference there. And once you establish that there's a difference between 100 and 300, maybe you then do 100 versus 200. And you keep making the difference between the two levels smaller until you no longer get an effect. The idea here is you first establish the effect with a strong manipulation, and then you keep giving weaker manipulations until you no longer can get the effect. So now you can say, if I only give them 150 compared to 100, I no longer get differences in anxiety.